Hopefully you can all hear me. It's nice to be back with you tonight. We're doing a series, of course, a little mini series in 1 Corinthians, or series is maybe too grand a term to use. I think maybe better just we've been dipping into 1 Corinthians a little bit. Tonight, last week we looked at 1 Corinthians 12. Tonight, I'd like to look with you at 1 Corinthians 13, at least just a part of it. So let me read it to you, 1 Corinthians chapter 13, and reading from verse 1. If I speak in the tongues of men and of angels, but do not have love, I am only a resounding gong or a clanging cymbal. And if I have the gift of prophecy and can fathom all mysteries and knowledge, and if I have a faith that can move mountains, but do not have love, I am nothing. If I give all I possess to the poor and give over my body to hardships that I may boast, but do not have love, I gain nothing. Love is patient, love is kind, it does not envy, it does not boast, it is not proud, it does not dishonor others, it is not self-seeking, it is not easily angered, it keeps no record of wrongs. Love does not delight in evil, but rejoices with the truth. It always protects, always trusts, always hopes, and always perseveres. Love never fails, but where there are prophecies, they will cease, and where there are tongues, they will be stilled. Where there is knowledge, it will pass away. For we know in part, and we prophesy in part, but when completeness comes, what is in part disappears. When I was a child, I talked like a child, and I thought like a child, and I reasoned like a child. When I became a man, I put the ways of childhood behind me. For now we see only a reflection as in a mirror. Then we shall see face to face. Now I know in part, then I shall know fully, even as I am fully known. And now these three remain: faith, hope, and love. But the greatest of these is love. Well, 1 Corinthians chapter 13 is, I suppose you could say, a romantic chapter, certainly a chapter with romantic associations. If you have ever been involved in the planning of a wedding, or even if you've been a guest at a wedding, then there's every likelihood that either on the invitation or on the order of service, somewhere a phrase or a word or two from this chapter is likely to have made an appearance on those. None of that is wrong, of course. It is a chapter about love, after all, and weddings are usually a celebration of love and the commencement of a new chapter in a love relationship. But in many cases, I think we often divorce what is said here from the context within which it makes the most sense, because rather than being a romantic chapter that makes us feel warm on the inside and wanting to stand around in a circle holding hands, instead of that, it is instead a stick of dynamite which strikes a blow at the very heart of the problems in the church at Corinth. The church at Corinth, as we've already noted, was beset with all manner of difficulties. Things like the fragmentation of its members, different groups forming behind different personalities. Alongside the fragmentation, of the church, there was the problem of certain gifted individuals cherishing inflated ideas of their own importance. They were so caught up with themselves that they just didn't seem to have time for anyone else. And so to address these problems, Paul outlines the Christian's responsibility to live together in love and in harmony. And the matter of Christian love, I think, is much more important than many people realize. Jesus himself said that one of the characteristics, if not the distinguishing characteristic of his followers, is that they would love one another. By this shall people know that you are my disciples, that you love one another. Yet despite the clarity of that statement that Jesus made, the Christians in Corinth did not love each other. At least if they did, they went about showing it in a very strange way. And no doubt the truth of this statement that Jesus made was passed on to them by the Apostle Paul when he was with them for 18 months in the founding of the church. Now, I want to draw your attention to this passage because as I go on in life, and one is conscious of getting older and entering new phases in life, as I go on in life, I realize how important Christian love is within homes and within families, and then within society, and then within churches. How different these environments would look if love were present. Many of the difficulties that exist in those environments would dissipate, if not instantly, in a very short period of time, if there was just a little bit more love present. Now, let me give you a very brief overview of the first three verses. In verse 1, I think the point which Paul is making in verse 1 is, without love, I produce nothing. So I might be able to do many wonderful things. I might be able to speak all of the languages spoken throughout the world. I might be able to speak the very language spoken by angels, if indeed there is such a thing as a language spoken by angels. And probably Paul is using hyperbole. But if what I do, despite having that kind of gift, if what I do is not shaped and framed in love, then you might as well bang a cymbal for the next 40 minutes or 30 minutes, because it would amount to the same thing. And so the starkness of the statement that is made in verse 1 is, your minister or your pastor may be a great preacher, but if he is devoid of love, then you might as well bang a cymbal as listen to him, because he is nothing more than a banging cymbal and a noisy gong. That's what a loveless person is. So without love, I produce nothing. Then in verse 2, I think the point that he is making is, without love, I am nothing. I may have the gift of declaring the word of God. I may have the most amazing understanding of the scriptures. I may have incredible faith so as to move mountains from one location to another. But, says Paul, even if I have all of those things and I do not have love, then I am nothing. Without love, Paul is saying in verse 2, I am zero. And you can have as many zeros as you like in a row. But unless there is a figure with some numerical value at the beginning of the zeros, no matter how many you have, they all amount to zero. Someone may be gifted in 1,000 different ways, but if they are loveless people and difficult to be around, then they are nothing. That's the point which Paul makes. So without love, I produce nothing. Without love, I am nothing, no matter what I think of myself. And then finally, in verse 3, he says, without love, I gain nothing. Some of the Corinthian Christians, it would appear, were engaging in wonderful Christian acts. I mean, wouldn't giving all of your goods to the poor impress God? Wouldn't dying the death of a martyr, giving your body to be burned, enduring all kinds of hardship, wouldn't that be something that would impress God? Well, says Paul, not really. Not by itself. Not unless it was motivated by love for him and love for people. So the point which is being made in verse 3 is, without love, I gain nothing. I accomplish nothing. I gain nothing. So the three things are, without love, I produce nothing. Without love, I am nothing. And then verse 3, without love, I gain nothing. So at the end of verse 3, we're left, having realized the importance of love, we're left asking the question, well, all of that is fine. Love is obviously very important. But then we're left asking the question, what is love? Is love just a warm feeling somewhere in your innermost being? And so to answer that question, Paul moves into his next section from verses 4, arguably, to verse 8a. And in that section, there are 15 descriptive terms of love. Now, if you think of love as a diamond with many facets, then what Paul gives us here are the many facets of the diamond of Christian love. Now, there are many ways in which you could read this passage. You could read this passage, for example, by placing the name Jesus, where you read the word love, or in the words of the Authorized Version, charity. So you could read, Jesus is patient. Jesus was kind. Jesus did not envy. But I guess the challenge that Paul wants his readers to face up to is, could we ever read that chapter by putting our own name where love is placed? Could I say, Robert is patient, and Robert is kind, and Robert is not rude, and Robert is not proud? This is the challenge, I think, that Paul wants the Corinthians to face up to. And by the same token, I think he wants us to face this challenge also. Now, the other thing which is worth noting about this little section in the middle of chapter 13 is that all of these verbs are in the present continuous tense. The present continuous tense. So the possession of these characteristics is not a one-off thing. We are not to be patient one day and say to ourselves, well, how wonderful that was. We were really patient yesterday. We are to be patient all of the time. And the outworking of love in its kaleidoscope of qualities is to be the habit of our lives. All of these qualities are to be present in our lives all of the time. We can't work on love, on patience today, and tomorrow we'll work on humility. All of these things are to be characteristic of us all of the time. Now, I don't really have 3 points for you tonight. The points are as they come to us in Scripture itself. I hope that the sermon won't be pointless. I think the points are fairly straightforward and fairly obvious. So the first thing that is said is that love is patient. Or in the words of the Authorized Version, love suffereth long. Makrothumeo is the word. It's a common word in the New Testament. And it's used mostly of being patient with other people. Love is patient. Love puts up with people. It takes time before it begins to fume and break into flames. It has a long rather than a short fuse. Some of us are a bit like fireworks. If somebody lights our touch paper, they need to stand back very quickly because there is at least the possibility that we will explode all over the place and perhaps explode in their face, because we don't have any patience. People have to tiptoe around us, because if they say the wrong thing, we could blow up without any notice. We may be great speakers, we may give a lot to church funds, we may be gifted in 1,000 different ways, but the truth is we are not patient. And Paul wants those of us who are like this to know that this is not on, because the love which marks a disciple of Jesus is patient. Now, just in case you think the Corinthians were sitting sort of in their church, listening to this letter being read to them, lapping it up, thinking, isn't this just wonderful teaching? This went against everything that they had been taught from their infancy upwards. The great Greek virtue was the refusal to tolerate insult or injury. Instead, it was taught that you should strike back immediately for the slightest offense. That was the sign of greatness. But Paul writes to the Corinthians and he says to them, I don't care about what you've been taught. And I don't care about your philosophical teachers. And I don't even care about your culture much. The love which marks a disciple of Jesus is patient. It suffereth long. Love acts as Jesus acted. And how did Jesus act? When he was reviled, he did not revile in return, but committed his cause to him who judges justly. I heard the story, and of course you think about Jesus and his patience. Think about the demonstration of patience at the cross as people mock him and he prays, Father, forgive them because they don't know what they do. And to one of the people that mocked him and who makes a scant request for mercy, he says, today you will be with me in paradise. Before Abraham Lincoln became the 16th president of the United States, he had a political opponent called Edwin Stanton. And Stanton was a fierce critic of Abraham Lincoln. On one occasion, somebody was going from the States to Africa to purchase a gorilla. And Stanton wrote to him and said, why bother going to Africa for a gorilla? You could have one right here in Springfield, Illinois, in the form of President Abraham Lincoln. Now, all of that's fine. When Lincoln became president, he was in office for only 1 year when he had to replace his war secretary. Who do you think he appointed? Edwin Stanton. He was asked, why in the world did you appoint Stanton as your war secretary? He said, because he is the best man for the job and I will treat him with every courtesy. When Lincoln was eventually assassinated and his body lay at rest, Stanton was one of the first to stand over the body of the dead president. And this is what he said, Stanton, Lincoln's political opponent, he said, this was the greatest leader of men that ever lived. You see, Lincoln's patience overcame Stanton's hostility. God is patient. It's one of God's great virtues. Look at how patient he has been with you and with me. Had God not been patient, where would any of us have been tonight? God is patient and he wants his children who claim to possess his nature. He wants them to possess patience. And so all of us need to ask the question, how patient are we? Well, love is patient. Then it says love is kind. Love is kind. Many things will be forgotten, but I don't think kindness will ever be forgotten. They will forget how intelligent you were. I think people will forget how funny and humorous you were. I think that people will forget how theologically in tune you were. But I don't think that people will forget your kindness, at least not in a hurry. When I was a teenager, my father was critically ill. He picked up tuberculosis, pneumonia, and pleurisy. And for a period, he tortured back and forward from the brink of death. My mother traveled to, of course, a big city hospital. We lived in the countryside. Every day, 50, 60 miles there, 60 miles home, to be with my father, not knowing if he was going to live or die. I can still remember the women that cooked meals for us as children and brought them so that my mother wouldn't have to worry about cooking when she came home. I can still remember the women that came and took away our clothes and washed them and dried them and ironed them and brought them back ready for us to wear. I've forgotten about the bright sparks that sat beside me in theological college, but I've never forgotten the names of those ladies. Kindness is long remembered. How kind are you? Would anyone say of you, that is a kind person? Do we look out for the needs of people around us? Do we support those in our fellowship who need our support? This is striking a blow at the very heart of the problems in Corinth, because God's people in this church knew very little about the ministry of kindness. It appears that many of them were only interested in themselves. Their services were amazing. People were coming from everywhere just to be part of the church services in Corinth. The singing, I am sure, was fantastic. Preachers like Apollos were able to wax eloquently. But here in this chapter, Paul is asking the question, what good is all of that if you're not kind to one another? What good is it if you're the best student in your class and you get straight A's in your exams? What does it matter whether you are the best businessman in town if your family and those who know you well have no record of you as would relate to kindness? What does all of your achievements matter if all that you have left behind you is a dreadful trail of badness, bitterness, and jealousy? Yet despite how clearly this is stated and how easy it is to understand, God's people in this church were not kind to each other. And God's people, I think, are still not kind to each other. Some of the things that we say to one another in the context of church are anything but kind. Some of us need to stop and ask ourselves the question, is what I am saying to this person kind or cruel? It might seem funny at the time, but how will the person feel when they go home and reflect on what has been said to them? How many people are wounded in our churches as a result of unkind words? How often have I sat with people in tears over the way that other people spoke to them? How many marriages are suffering from the absence of kindness? Because the very opposite of kindness rules the roost. Things like unkind words. I remember walking past a mother and her teenage daughter on my way to my car across a parking lot or a car park. And as I walked past, I could hear this girl, this teenage girl, bawling at her mother. I mean, bawling at her mother. And all of that was fine. I walked past, didn't say anything, got into my car and thought for a minute. Where did she learn to talk to her mother like that? Where did she learn to talk to her mother like that? I have a sneaking suspicion that she may have learned it from her father. Kindness does not treat people in a cruel way. Love looks in every way to be constructive and helpful. How kind are you? Are you a kind person? Will you be remembered for your kindness? Well, the third thing he says is that love does not envy, or love is not jealous. And there are a couple of kinds of envy. There's an envy or a jealousy that desires what other people have, whether it be their gifts or whether it be their personality. And so I'm driving along the road, and you know, I at the moment my own personal car is a little Suzuki Swift, and it's a bit beaten up. My son drove it home from England during one of the storms, and some stuff throttled the side of it. And so you stop at the lights and a gleaming new Tesla pulls up beside you, and you think to yourself, I want that. Why do I have to drive about in this beaten up wreck? I'd like one of those. But that's just jealousy, because my little Swift does everything that I need it to do. But there's another kind of jealousy which is much more destructive. And it's not so much that we want what other people have. It's just that we begrudge the fact that they have something that we don't have. It's not that we want it for ourselves. We just don't want them to have it. I can live with the fact that I don't have it, but I can't live with the fact that they have something that I don't have. Earlier today, I was reading in 1 Kings chapter 3:2 about Solomon and two ladies who lived in the same house, gave birth 3 days apart, came to him with a dispute. One mother, they had one baby between them. And it seems that during the night, one of the mother's babies died, and at least this is the story, and she had placed the child, the dead child, and with the other mother, and taken the living child. And of course, they came to Solomon saying, "It's my child." "No, it's my child." Solomon said, well, I'll tell you what we can do. We'll cut the baby in two. We'll give half to you and half to you. We need to think seriously about Solomon's proposal. But what transpired out of all of that was that the woman who did not own the living, who did not own the living baby, whose baby was dead, said, "Go ahead, cut the baby in two." But the mother whose baby was living said, no, don't harm the child. See, it wasn't that the woman whose baby was dead wanted the child. She just didn't want someone else having something that she didn't have. And that is the kind of envy that is eating away at the church members in Corinth. They're not happy with who they are. They're envious of other people's gifts and abilities. The teacher wants to be the evangelist, and the evangelist wants to be the encourager. Envy is rife, and it's destroying the harmony of the body of Christ. People have it in for one another, and who have what they want. And they weren't able, it seems, to grasp the elementary truth that the church is a body with every part having their place and function. When will the Christian church ever grasp the fact that we're not in a competition? We are not here to put each other down. We're here to join hands and move forward together in the work of Christ. There's a need for Mr. Rich. There's a need for Mr. Musical. There's a need for people who are brilliant with children. When will we ever accept ourselves for who God has made us and what God has given to us? When will we dispense with envy and stop trying to be like others and acquire their gifts and their personality? Envy and love have nothing in common. When love sees someone who is popular and successful, it will be happy for that person, not jealous and envious. Strikes me that when Jonathan discovered that God had chosen David to be the king, he took off his princely robes and his attire and gave them to David, because he rejoiced that God had chosen his friend. He was happy for his friend. No jealousy there. Why are we so jealous of other people? And when will we ever be content with who God has made us? Well, here's the fourth thing. Love does not boast, or if you like, it vaunteth not itself. It doesn't parade itself on the stage for everyone to see. The loving person who is successful doesn't seek a platform upon which to parade their own accomplishments. Love does not brag. But within the church at Corinth, there were a number of show-offs going around. In chapter 4, verse 7, Paul had to ask them, who made you any different from anyone else? And what do you have that you did not receive? And if you received it, if it was given to you, why do you boast as though it was something that you yourself kind of manufactured or came up with? It was given to you as a gift. I heard about one young preacher who was sitting in church, and who slipped in front of him? Only D.L. Moody. And he was all beside himself, waiting for the service to end so that he could speak to the great evangelist. When the service was over, he plucked up the courage to speak to Moody, and he says to Moody, Mr. Moody, would you pray for me? And Mr. Moody says, what do you want me to pray about, son? And he says, would you pray that God would keep me humble? Mr. Moody looked at him and said, and what would you have to be proud about? And it's a great question. What do any of us have to be proud about? What do any of us have that was not given to us? And the truth is, God could take it all away in a flash. May God save us from becoming proud churches, because God can shut the doors of proud churches. God save us from becoming proud preachers. God can silence people. God could silence me before this service is over, and I would never speak again. May God save us from becoming proud people, because God resists the proud and gives grace to the humble. And if you want to see an example of God resisting the proud, look at the story of Nebuchadnezzar, who looks over his kingdom and thinks he's fantastic, but in the morning he's out in the fields like a wild animal. Some of us enjoy being the center of attention, and we want everyone to know how wonderful we are. And says Paul to the Corinthians, love knows nothing of that. Love is not anxious to impress. Love behaves like Jesus. Love is willing to take up the mantle of servanthood. Love is willing to take up the lowly position. Love is not full of itself. Love knows why it has, what it has, and gives all the glory to God. So love does not boast, it vaunteth not itself, it doesn't parade itself around for other people to look at. Well, fifthly then, love is not proud. The word here is phusiutai, and it sort of speaks of a big cloud of smoke that's, it looks big, but it's got no substance. And love is not proud. Love is not a big plume of smoke. Philip's paraphrase of this says, love does not cherish inflated ideas of its own importance. And the absence of humility in Corinth was conspicuous. Humility was conspicuous by its absence. And it appears that a number of them thought that they had arrived at perfection already. They were thinking more highly of themselves than they ought to have. They could have written the book Humility and How I Attained It, or I am not conceited, but I have every right to be so. They were utterly bereft. Some individuals within this church were utterly bereft of humility, the mark of so many of God's great servants. They were a bit like Oscar Wilde. When he was clearing customs, he was asked, do you have anything to declare? Oh, he says, nothing but my genius. In complete contrast to that is John the Baptist. A group came from Jerusalem and went down to interview him at the Jordan. And of course, the question was, are you the one, John? And he says, no, I'm not the one. I'm just a voice crying in the wilderness. I'm not even worthy to untie the sandal straps of the person who is the one. Love is not proud. We live in a world that exalts people who have inflated ideas of their own importance. And it's desperately hard not to get caught up with the same mentality. Arrogance has a big head, but love has a big heart. William Carey, of course, went to India, translated parts of the Bible into 34 dialects or languages. And he was at a party of the East Indian Company, some kind of a tea party. And there was a woman who disliked Carey. And she stood up in public to humiliate him in a speech. And she says, so, Carey, we hear back in England you were a shoemaker. Oh, no, man, he says, I was not a shoemaker. I was just a shoe mender. See, she put him down, but he put himself even lower, because love is not proud. Love is not proud. Love is not rude. Love does not behave indecently or in a shameful manner. Love is good manners. Love does not embrace what is dishonorable or disgraceful. There's a graciousness in Christian love that never forgets that things like courtesy, tact, and politeness are lovely things. Bishop Lightfoot said of one of his students, and it always struck me, let him go where he will, his face will be a sermon in itself. But rudeness had become the trademark of this church. Everything that they did, almost everything that they did, was marked by unbecoming behavior. At the love feasts, the rich would ignore the poor. They'd start without them and eat like gluttons, and the poor, when they were released from their duties as slaves, could gather up the scraps that were left behind. And that's how it was in the world. The rich always went first, and the poor could come along behind. But that's not how it is in the family of faith. The truth is, some Christians are a disgrace in the way that they conduct themselves in front of others. Some of the things that I've heard people say is nothing short of shameful. This is a step further than unkindness. The things that some Christians say isn't just unkind, it's just rude. Many Christians could not witness to their unsaved friends because their behavior, the behavior which has gone before, would contradict everything that they might ever want to say. But love is not rude. It has good manners, and love is a nice person to know. Many years ago, there was a professor, Christian professor at Edinburgh University called Stuart Blackie. And it was in the days when they taught oral recitations and so on. And he was teaching his students how to read. And of course, he told them how to hold the book in their right hand and to project their voice and so on. And then the students began to take their turn, each of them lifting their books and the right hand holding it and projecting their voice. Then one student took the book in his left hand. And Blackie thundered down the classroom and said, I told you to take the book in your right hand. And the boy held up his right arm, and it ended at his wrist. He didn't have a right hand. Everybody's shifting uncomfortably in their seats, wondering what will happen now. Stuart Blackie went down to the boy and put his arm around him and said, I am deeply sorry. I had no idea. I was completely out of hand. Please forgive me. That story was being told as part of a sermon in Charlotte Chapel some months or years later. And at the end of the sermon, a young man stood up at the front of the church and he held up his right arm and it ended at his wrist. And he says, I was the boy in that story. And Professor Blackie led me to put my faith in Christ. But he says he could never have done it if he had not put the wrong right. He could never have done it if he had not put the wrong right. Love is not rude. Well, love does not pursue is not self-seeking. It does not pursue selfish advantages. It doesn't try to do well at the expense of other people. Love doesn't insist that all the privileges are mine and all the responsibilities someone else's. Love cares about more than just itself. Yet too many in the church at Corinth were concerned only about their own needs and satisfying their own needs. And as the watching world looked on, all they could see was selfishness reigning supremely. There is a human tendency in all of us to get caught up with ourselves. There's a tombstone that says, here lies a miser who lived for himself, who cared for nothing but gathering wealth. Now where he is and how he fares, nobody knows and nobody really cares. But in complete contrast to that, there is a stone in St. Paul's in London, and if you ever go, you'll see it, and it's laid to the memory of Sir Charles George Gordon, who at all times and everywhere gave his strength to the weak his substance to the poor, his sympathy to the suffering, and his heart to God. Well, I better wind up. Let me just mention one more, if you will. Love is not easily provoked. Love is not bad-tempered. It's not irritable. It's not cantankerous. It's not easily ignited, as we've already seen. It's not flammable like gas or petrol. Now, there's an obvious link between patience and not being easily provoked. Patience seems to relate to how we interact with people, but not being easily provoked speaks about not being easily angered. There's such a thing as righteous anger. Of course, there is. Jesus was angry when he saw what the religious leaders had done to his Father's house. But how often is our anger righteous? How often is our anger righteous indignation? For the most part, our ego has been wounded, our program has been upset. And the truth is, we are irritable and cantankerous rascals who are as unchristlike as they are to come. Jonathan Edwards had a daughter, and a young man came to ask for her hand in marriage. "You can't have her," insisted Mr. Edwards. "Why?" said the young man. "She's not worthy of you," was the reply. "Why is she not worthy of me? She's a Christian, isn't she?" "Yes," said Mr. Edwards, "but the grace of God can live with people that you could never live with." It's pointless, isn't it, to tell the people around us that we love them if we fly off the handle when they do something that irritates us. Don't be irritable. Love is not easily angered. Love keeps no record of wrongs. Logizomai, it's a bookkeeping term. It doesn't keep a record of all the stuff that has happened. And when you poke someone, out comes all the hurts that they've ever experienced. Love is able to remember, but love chooses to forgive. Love doesn't forgive and forget. Love remembers. Let's be realistic. Love remembers, but it chooses to forgive. And it chooses not to hold a grudge, and it chooses to let it go. Love is like the prodigal father in the story of the prodigal son. He goes out day after day looking for his son. And maybe the elder brother said to him, "You're going out to look for that rascal again who has spent all your money in riotous living?" "Yes, I'm going out to look for him again. And I'll keep going out to look for him until this son who is lost to me, dead to me, is found again." That's love. It holds no records of wrongs. And the Christians in this church in Corinth need to possess a little bit more love. Well, there's a whole section at the end of the chapter, which is just fascinating. But right at the end, he says, "Now these remain, faith, hope, and love. But the greatest of these," he says, "is love." It's difficult to know why love is the greatest in this context. Perhaps it's because it is eternal. Our faith will give way to sight in heaven. Our hopes will be realized and will be with Christ. But love will never fade away. As Jonathan Edwards said, heaven is a world of love. And those of you who are parents and grandparents know that love is the greatest. What is the thing that means most to you? I was thinking about this as I left a trophy back at the weekend. One of my sons won, and I left it back, and I was thinking, what is it that means the most to me as a parent? Is it the trophies that they've won and the medals that they've won for hockey and best prize for being the top student in their year? None of that stuff matters a great deal. You know what means the most? A little crumpled up note that I have in my wallet that says, "You're the best dad in the world, and I loved you." Love is the greatest of these. Paul says, "Now remains faith, hope, and love. But the greatest of these is love." Love is the flag flying high from the castle of my heart. And what does it tell the world? That the King is in residence here. Love is the flag. And I trust and pray that you will make sure it flies from the castle of your heart. Well, thank you for listening. Maybe a little longer than I should have been, but apparently this is my finale. So next week's speaker will be a lot shorter, I'm sure. John, I'm handing back to you.